We've just received official news on the stats and abilities of Camellya's weapon, and wow, this thing is confusing. With a weapon effect that seems to contradict the very mechanics of the game itself and some of the highest possible damage buffs we've ever seen on a weapon, it's safe to say that this could be the strongest signature in Wuthering Waves. If, and it's a big if, you're using it on Camellya. And it's given us a lot of clues on what exactly she'll do on the battlefield. Any player who's had a chance to preview this effect likely has a ton of questions. How powerful is it? Is it usable on multiple characters? And of course, knowing the nature of gacha games, is it actually worth pulling? Some of these questions have definitive answers, while others vary depending on the state of your account. When you're able to share weapons across endgame content, keeping your roster of characters in mind whenever you pull a weapon is a great way to maximize the value of your pulls. And who doesn't like doing that? Typically, weapons are shared among DPS characters who can make great use of a 5 stars increased base stats, and Camellya's signature is a prime example of this. And today we'll be taking the time to answer those questions you might be having on Red Spring, breaking down its odd mechanics and activation conditions, who can actually make use of its effect, and the big one, whether or not it's worth pulling based off the state of your account. It's a powerful weapon, rest assured, but there are some very accessible options that'll still pack a punch for this absolute lunatic. As always, if you're enjoying this content, please hit that like and subscribe button. Our analysis of Red Spring begins with its raw stats, and it's pretty standard for a signature weapon. It's got a base attack of 587 and a 24.3% crit rate at max level, making it identical to options like Jinxi's or Zhang Liao's signature, or even the standard sword, Emerald of Genesis. Weapons with a crit rate main stat are typically a bit easier to work with than those with crit damage, primarily due to the fact that for optimal performance, you use a 4-cost Echo with the opposite stat. These 4 costs at max level have a lower overall value than weapons, and considering how crit damage completely relies on rate to actually have an impact, this small but noticeable increase makes it a lot easier to manage your overall Echo substats and limit some of the frustrations while farming. However, it's undeniable that crit damage weapons with perfect substats will oftentimes have a better performance. And with the release of Shorekeeper and her fantastic buffs to critical rate, it's become even easier to balance your ratios. The weapon's best-in-class base attack also ensures that all of your percentage attack buffs from sources like your Echoes, Sonatas, and character skills will also have the maximum effect, as they all calculate off the base stats of your Resonator and their weapon. It's a great balance of stats, but at the end of the day, they're only one part of a weapon's impact. Oftentimes, a weapon's skill can be the main driving force for its effectiveness, and Camellya's weapon is easily one of the most unique we've seen in the game, at least when it comes to DPS characters. This weapon grants a 12% buff to attack, which is very similar to Chong-Li's signature sword, but more importantly, 2 different buffs to basic attack damage. The first applies with stacks, with basic attacks themselves granting 10% per stack with a short cooldown for a max of 30% and a duration of 14 seconds. While the second buff activates after consuming any concerto energy, grants a 40% buff, lasts for 10 seconds, and crazily enough, ends its effect after the character leaves the field. This weapon skill tells us quite a few things. First, Camellya is a character that scales primarily with basic attack damage, with the weapon at full buffs granting a whopping 70% to the stat alongside its 12% attack bonus. It's one of the biggest buffs that any basic attack focused sword DPS can work with, completely outperforming other signatures who oftentimes only give a total of 60% damage, when combining the 12% attribute buff with the 48% boost to a damage type. The second thing is that Camellya has some mechanic built into her kit that allows her to consume concerto energy without leaving the field, which has some very interesting implications for her team comps and rotations. The third is that Camellya is probably the only character in the game who will actually be able to use these full buffs. The fact of the matter when it comes to concerto energy is that every character uses concerto energy to leave the field, activating their outro skill and the incoming Resonator's intro skill. There is no character in the game, let alone a sword wielder, that can consume concerto energy without leaving the field. That's not the best. This unfortunate activation condition ensures that the biggest buff on this weapon, that 40% bonus to basic attack damage, is completely obsolete on every other character on the roster. But for the other 30 30%? Characters like Dan Jin, Yang Yang, and Spectral Rover have almost no damage at all coming from their basic attacks in their rotations, while Sanhua only uses them to activate massive buffs to benefit all of her other sources of damage. And Chong Li heavily prefers buffs to resonance skills and liberations, making Havoc Rover, another Havoc DPS, the only real potential user for this signature, as they have a hypercarry playstyle focused on basic attacks in their enhanced state to deliver most of their damage. A majority of the roster, surprisingly enough, uses swords, but none of them have the kit to actually activate this weapon's full buffs. And what that means is that all it provides for characters who aren't Camellya is a 12% attack buff and a stacking bonus of 30% basic attack damage. That's not bad, but it's not anything to write home about. And one very important trade-off to pulling this weapon is all of the other incredibly competitive options there are. Emerald of Genesis, the standard 5-star sword, is the first thing that comes to mind here. With base stats that are identical to Camellya's signature and a far more general weapon effect that can benefit the entire roster, this weapon is my go-to pick as an alternative for your Camellya, or really any other sword user. You'll do a fair amount less damage when compared to Camellya's signature, but with the weapon completely guaranteed on the standard banner as well and accessible at UL 45, my recommendation is that you try out Camellya with this weapon before deciding to invest in her signature. With both weapons having a crit rate stat, you won't even need to swap your 4-cost Echo. There simply aren't a lot of characters who benefit from Red Spring's weapon effect, unlike many other signatures, and these pulls are a big price to pay when you'll likely get fantastic performance on a potentially free option, much like how Chong Li does without Blazing Brilliance. When it comes to other options, they're either a lot stronger or weaker depending on a sword user's damage type. Blazing Brilliance is a fantastic resonance skill damage buffer, but falls short on characters who don't deal much of that damage type, making it primarily useful on characters like Dan Jin and Chong Li, characters who have almost no synergy with Camellya's weapon. When it comes to 4-star options, there are some surprisingly decent picks. Endless Collapse is likely your best 4-star replacement due to its incredibly high base attack relative to other 4-stars and its very general effect that buffs attack and increases energy regen, while the BP weapon, Lumingloss, is the next best alternative, due to its massive buffs to base attack, which we all know Camellya is going to be using a lot. The only other viable 4-stars are Lunar Cutter and Commando of Conviction, and I would not recommend using either of these options unless you have no other options. Emerald of Genesis is too easy to access to ever warrant using these weapons, so it's typically a far better use of your experience and credits to never even invest in them at all. There's a fair amount of competition when it comes to swords, and Camellya's weapon is unfortunately one of the most specific in the game, from both the damage type it buffs and its very odd activation conditions. Based off where this discussion is going, you might have a good idea on the potential value of Camellya's signature, and unlike its effect, its value is pretty simple. On one hand, if you have Emerald of Genesis, I highly recommend you try that out on Camellya first and gauge your performance before spending on her weapon. With its identical stats, you can simply upgrade at a later point without wasting any resources, and you might find your damage is sufficient to do whatever you need to for clearing content. On the other hand, if you want Camellya to do the highest damage possible, this weapon is going to give you the best overall performance. It is the best signature in the game for its intended user. And on the third hand, you might only have one copy of Emerald of Genesis and you simply want a second 5-star sword. Dan Jin and Sanhua will be some of Camellya's best teammates, and while you can share weapons across teams, you can't share weapons in the teams themselves, so pulling this weapon might be necessary for some of your intended teams. With that, Camellya is not the only thing coming in version 1.4, and hopefully this overview was helpful in highlighting the value of her signature. As always, if you enjoyed this content, please hit that like and subscribe button. Peace out.